Welcome to the TC Dojo, where you choose the topics and we find the experts. This morning we are excited to have Joe Devney as our visiting dojo master. Joe has a wide-ranging interest in language and linguistics. He's a distinguished editor, especially for non-native speakers who are submitting their work to professional journals. He has a master's degree in linguistics from Georgetown and applies that experience to real-world problems in business and legal fields. He's a professional nonfiction writer, a trained developmental editor and copy editor, and has served the STC as chair of the Berkeley Professional Chapter. This presentation is the second in a two-part series. In the last session, he laid the foundation for today's stories. He laid out the risks and consequences to businesses who deliver insufficient, poorly written documentation and those who fail to provide documentation at all. If you missed the first session, you can see it on our TC Dojo web channel. But now, let's get started, and I will turn the presentation over to our visiting dojo master, Joe Devney. Joe?
I'm here. Okay.
All right. Show your screen and it's all yours.
All right. That's me. Okay. So, good morning.
Wait. You need to hit the show your screen button. There you go.
I did. You got it?
Yep.
All right. Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining. This is what the topic is and who I am. And as Liz explained, this is part 2 of the webinar, and you can go find part 1 if you need to. We're talking about potential business costs of poor documentation. Because today we're discussing legal issues, the costs are mostly related to lawsuits. Getting sued can be expensive. I asked on LinkedIn Answers, back when LinkedIn Answers existed, how much it costs to defend against a product liability suit. I wanted a ballpark figure, and I'm going to share a couple of responses with you. This one, take a moment to look at this one. So this estimate came from a lawyer in Las Vegas, maybe $100,000. This lawyer in New York broke the cost down in more detail, and he offered a higher estimate, maybe $500,000. And as we'll see later, the amount can grow lots more. Whatever the actual cost of a particular lawsuit is, it won't be cheap. In part 1, I talked a bit about legal and regulatory issues. I told the story of JetsGo, the Canadian airline that went out of business within weeks of an audit that found inadequate technical documentation. And I told a couple of stories from my own experience. Today, let's start with something you probably already know about: copyright. So, things to think about. Copying is easy. Copying is not necessarily legal. Managers and other staff members might not think about this. And I gave a couple of examples in part 1. I gave examples of managers and engineers who didn't understand about copyright law, and they could have gotten their employers in trouble. Those are from my own experience, but today I want to talk to you about a company you already know, Google, specifically Google Books. Google had an idea for an ambitious project that would showcase their whiz-bang engineering skills. Hey, there are millions of books in libraries that people can't get to. We could scan them all, add search functionality, and put them online for free. To an engineer, this might sound like a good, challenging project. It may also have sounded like good publicity to the marketing department. But to a writer, it sounds like theft. Maybe they didn't talk to the writers. I hope they talked to the lawyers so they knew what they were getting into. Here's what happened. It was a big project and took a couple of years' work before anything was available to the public. It did get the attention of writers and publishers. 2 big lawsuits were filed against Google Books the year after that. Now, a couple of minutes ago, I showed you a ballpark figure for the cost of a lawsuit of $500,000. Some ballparks are much bigger. Look at that last bullet point. In 2008, Google was willing to pay $125 billion to settle the lawsuit. That didn't work out, and the suit went on for a couple more years. I won't go into all the details, but here's where things stand now. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed by the judge, but the Authors Guild is appealing the judge's decision, so things are still not over. We are at 9 years and counting. Now, it may be that Google Books is doing what Google hoped it would for the company, but the lawsuits are taking time and money and people away from other projects. It's expensive even if they win. And if they lose, it could cost the company even more money in the 9-figure range. So make sure your management is aware of copyright issues. As a writer or any kind of content producer, you can be the local expert. And as I mentioned in part 1, if you don't know copyright law, go home today and look it up online. Oh, and one thing I mentioned in part 1 that also bears repeating, if you are advising management to follow up copyright law, the corporate legal department will be on your side. So any questions about copyright? Okay, then we'll go on. If there is no settlement between the parties, a lawsuit will end up in a courtroom. And that's a world with its own rules. Here's an example from outside of technical communication, but I think it's instructive. It shows the power courts can have. In this case, we're looking at the power of the court to enforce contracts. Let's read this clause together. For all reasonable expense incurred in connection with the investigation, settlement, or defense of such claims or suits, and the company's reimbursement obligation for the settlement of all damages imposed on and expenses incurred by the insured shall be limited to the amount stated in the policy as the applicable limit of the company's liability for damages that the company may, at its discretion, participate in the defense or settlement of such claims or suit. Does that make sense to you? This is an excerpt from an insurance contract. Two companies were in court to determine how the costs of millions of dollars relating to a particular lawsuit were to be split between them. In the contract, this sentence was called Special Endorsement Number 1. The judge gave it a different name. The judge called this particular passage gibberish. What did he do? He threw it out. He ignored it because it didn't make any sense. He said it would not be addressed in the trial. And there's a lesson here for technical documentation. Take a moment to read this. Some companies' documentation templates have a disclaimer like this. Maybe you work for one of them. Consider the gibberish paragraph and also the consequences for Jets Go of inadequate documentation. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I have been a manager. And I wouldn't want to stake my company's continuing existence on this sentence holding up in court. It's best to make sure that the documentation itself is accurate. Let's look at a specific case where the technical documentation was at issue. What happened here could happen to you. A linguist, somebody like me, might go over your documentation with a fine-tooth comb. Because of my background in technical communication, I'd probably be even more thorough than most linguists. Now, this is another long sentence, and I apologize, but I think this is important to get this across. In written texts, discourse structure is marked by patterns of organization, such as the introduction and recycling of topics, the logic of sequencing of topics, the use of speech acts such as warnings, the semantic differences between the speech acts of warning and advising, and the way certain communicative devices, such as the use of repetition, discourse markers, specificity, and orthographic features, are employed. The jargon here is from a different field, and it's written in a wordy academic style. But he's talking about things that technical writers work with all the time, our tools of language use and document design. How do you arrange the information? How do you let the reader know what is more or less important? How do you direct the reader's eye? How do you make information easy to find? And by the way, this applies to both online and printed documentation. This sentence appeared in a book by forensic linguist Roger Shy, who was one of my mentors in the field. That book also included the story of a case he worked on. Let me give you the background on that case. The Anderson family worked for a traveling carnival. It was a small family, father, mother, and son. One morning, Mr. Anderson woke up in the family's RV and he felt sick. He woke his wife. She was sick too. Their son wouldn't wake up at all, so they took him to the emergency room. It turned out that they all suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning. The parents missed work for a time, but the son had it the worst. He may have permanent brain damage. The source of the carbon monoxide was the electrical generator in their RV. They talked to a lawyer to find out if they could sue someone. The lawyer brought in 2 experts, an engineer to evaluate the generator and its installation, and a linguist to evaluate the owner's manual. It's the manual we're going to talk about. When the Andersons bought their generator, they had choices. They could have an Onan generator installed at the factory, or they could have any brand installed by the Fleetwood dealer. Fleetwood was the brand of the RV itself. They chose the Generac brand, and they're suing Generac. So the analysis included comparing Generac's manual to 2 others, as you see in the bullets, Fleetwood and Onan. We're going to see this again later. There's an important lesson for you. If you want to increase your chances of avoiding or winning a lawsuit like this, make sure that your technical documentation is at least as good as your competitors. So, what did the linguist find? Let's look. One message to the user is to make sure that nothing blocks the flow of exhaust from the generator. Here is how Generac addressed the issue. Look at the end of the text, the part in italics. What are they warning the user about? Damage to the product. Let's see how Onan addressed the issue. Very different. They get the reader's attention with warning right at the beginning and death in the first sentence. Their first concern was harm to people. In part 1 of this webinar, I mentioned that one potential cause of inadequate documentation is too much influence from the marketing department. I think that may be the case here for Generac. The marketing department is averse to anything that would reflect badly on the company or the product. I can easily imagine that someone at Generac made the argument that, well, if we talk about the danger of death, people won't want to buy the product. We can't say that. How about we warn people that if they block the ventilation, the generator won't work? They will still know not to do it, and they won't be scared away. But if there's a real danger, there are many reasons to mention it explicitly. Here's what Generac said about inspecting the generator. What is periodically? Every 3,000 miles, like changing your oil? Look at the competitor's equivalent. I'll give you a moment to read that. Here, the issue is specificity. Onan tells you how often to do the inspection and what to look for. So that's the kind of stuff the expert witness compared. Let's look at a summary of his report. So the manual failed to recycle important warnings, to give warnings about sleeping, warnings about the need for a carbon monoxide detector. So a couple of weaknesses related to content. The top one relates to technical writing skills. Okay, take a moment to read this slide. So we're talking about technical writing issues again, and we're not done. The first bullet point here harks back to what I said in part 1 about following the rules if you are regulated. Here he's talking about the ANSI standard hazard definitions. The other 2 are specifically about the skills that professional technical writers bring to the job. Here's what happened with this case. Because they settled, we don't know how much Generac had to pay out, but we do know it would have been a large amount of money. By the way, in case you're not familiar with how this works, the plaintiff were able to obtain an acceptable settlement. That means they went to the defendant, to Generac, showed them the report, and said, look at this. If we go to court, you're going to lose. Why don't you just give us money now? And not take a chance on losing lots more in court. So how much money? Take a moment to look at this. This looks like it easily would add up to 6 figures, maybe 7. Any questions?
None so far.
Okay, then we will go on. Let's move on to something even more serious. This is a story you may remember from the mid-1990s. A plane crashed in the Florida Everglades. It had caught fire in midair and went down 10 minutes after takeoff. All 110 people aboard were killed. If you want to talk about financial cost, the airplane was worth $4 million. Cleanup costs for the county and state totaled more than $10 million. I believe the airline also went out of business shortly after this. And bad news for our profession, part of the blame for the accident went to technical documentation. Let me give you some technical background. You know how the flight attendant tells you to pull sharply on the oxygen mask? That's because the plane doesn't actually have tanks of oxygen for you. Your yanking on the mask pulls a pin in a canister over your head called an oxygen generator. This allows two chemicals to mix, starting a reaction that produces oxygen. This is also what chemists would call an exothermic reaction. It produces heat, a lot of heat. The problem with Flight 592, ValueJet Flight 592, is that these oxygen generators were not handled properly. Some canisters had been taken out of another airplane and were in a cardboard box in the cargo hold. What the NTSB says happened is that the oxygen generators did not have their safety caps on, and they were just laid on their sides in the box. One or more of them was set off by being jostled during takeoff. So, a cardboard box, a canister heating up to 450 or 500 degrees, and a high oxygen atmosphere. This is a very bad combination. Take a moment to read this. ValueJet hired a third-party maintenance company called SaberJet to remove old oxygen generators from a plane they had bought. The manual they worked from was modeled on one from the airplane's manufacturer. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted an investigation into the crash. In the documentation, they focused on a couple of specific weaknesses, and that's what they're talking about here in this quote. This is important safety information that was left out. And specifically, there was an important step left out of one procedure. So take a moment to read that. The canisters were near their expiration dates, so they're going to be replaced. The missing step, the 8th step mentioned here, was to put the old canisters on a non-combustible surface and pull the pins. Once they have heated up and then cooled down, they are no longer a fire danger. The manual that SaberJet worked from made no mention of this. More from the report, so go ahead and read that. If the documentation had included this important information, the plane probably wouldn't have caught fire. Now, you remember that with the carbon monoxide case, the linguist compared the defendant's documentation to its competitors? The NTSB did the same thing. Alaska Airlines in this case. Alaska Airlines included the information. Why didn't ValueJet? Take a moment to read this. So let me repeat. One good way to increase your chances of avoiding or winning lawsuits like these is to make sure your documentation is at least as good as that of your competitors. Now, we can't really do audience participation in this webinar. I can't give you the work card to review. So let me just go through this last part. The NTSB identified a couple of important weaknesses in work card 69. But technical writing and document design are my areas of expertise, and I saw several more things in the document that could lead to user error. Here we go. Now, this first bullet point is probably something you do all the time. Look at documentation with a critical eye. The second one, what might be the sources of the weaknesses, goes a little deeper. What might be the cause of the problems you find? This is a more fruitful question. Now, suppose you are a TechPubs manager or a consultant brought in to fix the technical documentation. If you saw an instruction like work card 69, what advice would you give company management? For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to share some of my own opinions. So, here's an easy one. Look at this warning. 4 lines in all caps. As you probably know, all caps for more than a line or so interferes with readability. If you write an entire paragraph in all capital letters, you are effectively encouraging readers to skip it entirely. Their caution here is use caution. That's pretty weak phrasing, and they don't say exactly what the problem is. There are actually accepted standards for how to use words like caution. The writer here had no clue. This is the standard definition from ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, except I don't think they use all the words anymore. A caution statement should tell what must be done and the consequences of not doing it, which means more than just use caution. Makes it less effective and also something that may be flagged in an audit or an investigation. Now here's something where we can dig just a little bit deeper. It says trim about 1 inch, which is 25.4 millimeters. Except it's not. The two measurements are not equivalent because the precision differs by orders of magnitude. The inch measurement says you need to be accurate to about 1/40th of a meter. The metric number says you need to be accurate to 1/10,000th of a meter, and it's wrong for that reason. The way this is written, it says that if I grew up in the United States, I can guess the correct length. Maybe I'll use my knuckle as a guide to figure out what about an inch is. But if I grew up anywhere else and think in metric, I have to go find a micrometer before cutting anything. What this tells me is that whoever wrote these instructions didn't understand what they were writing about. So, what do we tell management? First, I would talk about the specific problems I found in the document. The organization could be improved. The formatting makes it hard to read. The writing style is not good. And as I mentioned on the last slide, the writing shows a poor understanding of the content. Now, many managers won't care. Documentation is not their area of expertise, and the details of, for example, document formatting are of no interest to them. But you need to first talk about the specific problems in order to build your case. Next, I would recommend steps that the company should take in order to address the weaknesses I identified. Take a moment to read this. But why would they want to spend money to do this stuff? It might be time to be blunt. I tell them what bad stuff might happen. So, any questions?
I think everyone is stunned like I am.
My goodness. Didn't mean to do that.
Great. Well, I'll give everybody a chance to type in their questions. Thank you, Joe. We'll talk about what's coming up and give you a chance to type them in. So here's what we've got coming up. All right. In the next TC Dojo, we're going to talk DITA. It's been a long time since we've talked DITA in the TC Dojo, actually probably close to a year. But in this session, we're going to talk about keys and con keys and how to use them, why they do it, how to plan your reuse from a strategic perspective. So if you're using DITA or curious about how this part works, you might really want to sign up. How do you sign up? Well, you just go to the TC Dojo website. Right on that page, I can show you what it looks like. Right on that page, you just scroll down. You'll see all the upcoming sessions that are scheduled to be here. And if you didn't miss the last one, you'll be able to see that last session here. So very soon now we'll post Joe's session right here and you'll have a chance to look at them. All right, so just go there. You can also vote for your choice of upcoming session topics on that site also. Our next mastermind session is May 26th. If you ever had a chance to spin your wheels and you have no one to talk to work out your things, the TC Dojo Mastermind is a real-time sort of support group where people get together and talk about what they're doing. Very similar to our virtual Birds of a Feather table. The groups are kept small on purpose. So if you're looking for something like that and you want to be able to find better ways to do things you never would have considered on your own, there are slots currently available. You can find more at the TC Dojo page as well. All right, so questions. What have we got here? Oh, we got a good one. What about copyright issues for schematics and CAD drawings provided by suppliers? How can I be sure copyright law hasn't been violated by the supplier? Good question.
Supplied by the supplier, I think you're going to have to trust them. If there's a reason you might be suspicious, I would start by talking to the legal department. You look in the documentation you got from the supplier, they probably say something about that in the front matter in the manual or in the somewhere buried on the website. But if they're providing something to you, it's their obligation to make sure it's legal.
All right, there we go. Tom, let us know if that answers your question. I had a question. You gave a great reference to the Shui book. If you can, I think I missed where it was. If you can send that to me again, I'll post that information for the video and a link for everybody because I think that's sounded like a really good one. And if you have other recommendations?
Oh, yeah, that Roger Shy book.
Shy, okay.
Yeah, that is very good. I will email you. Would you want an Amazon link?
Sure. Or maybe your favorite reading list. We'll post it with the video. Or if you want to write up a post, I'll point to you. That'd be good.
Okay, let's talk about that offline, and I'll give you whatever we think is best.
Okay, so folks, that way you'll get access to all that stuff. I know that I've got some reading on my schedule now. It sounded really good. That Google number was really high. I had no idea.
Oh, the $125 million?
Yeah, or that it wasn't settled.
Yeah, it's still going on.
And where is ValueJet now? Oh my gosh.
They were by somebody else.
Were they? I didn't
yeah.
know. That's
and I think it was less than a year after the accident.
I was at a session in New England at the STC New England group a couple of weeks ago, and a presenter said that actually all the biggest airline accidents in recent memory were documentation related. He had 3 examples. Does that
okay,
sound...
well, that's scary for us.
Well, that's true. I didn't think of it that way.
And it's also part of the reason I keep putting this message out, because this webinar follows an article in Intercom, and it follows presentations I've made at STC chapters, because I want the people in our profession to let the managers know that this is serious stuff and they have to pour resources into into technical communication, make sure we do it right so people don't die, so companies don't go out of business.
Absolutely. It's part of why it's really why we wanted to have you in here, because I think it's a very important topic. And I know that it's always shocking when I hear you speak about any of it. All right. Making sure that Tom.
A little bit. I don't know if I wanted to shock you.
All right. And where do people go if they want to learn more about how to do this? Sort of how to get good at looking at documentation. Like you have the eye to see it, and you know all of these things. Where else would people go to learn stuff like this? Come to you, but
STC has good resources. I've picked up a lot of this stuff at presentations at like STC conferences or speakers at STC chapters. There's let's see. The book that started me was How to Communicate Technical Communication by Jonathan Price.
All right, let's put that in the chat window for everybody. And I will make sure to put that as well. Jonathan Price. And the book name was again?
How to Communicate Technical Information.
All right, folks. There you have it. All right, well, we've hit the end of our hour. It's a really good conversation. Thank you, Joe. It's super important information, and oh my God, it's no wonder I love to come to your sessions. I always do. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise with us.
Okay.
And then we have a thanks from people in the audience. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.